Okay, let's get started. Number 5, B-59 submarine. In 1961, the Soviet nuclear submarine K-19 had a malfunction in the cooling system that led to a radiation leak, which prompted 22 members of its crew to expose themselves to high doses of radiation in a heroic and suicidal manner that saved the world at that time from a nuclear disaster and killed them all. After this incident, the Soviet Union decided to rely on diesel submarines until better and safer nuclear submarines were developed. Keep this story in your mind because we will return to it. On October 1962, in the middle of the Cold War and in the midst of the Cuban nuclear missile crisis, President Kennedy announced the imposition of a naval blockade on Cuba. Meanwhile, a Soviet submarine called B-59 was in the Sargasso Sea near Cuba, and it had a nuclear torpedo. As a result of the submarine diving to great depths in the sea and the distance between it and Russia, communications with the Soviet leadership were cut off. But the communications officer on the submarine succeeded in receiving a radio broadcast from Miami, and he was surprised by the announcement of the blockade, preparations for the invasion of Cuba, and the raising of the state of alert for DEFCON 2. Therefore, the submarine crew was certain that World War III had begun on the surface of the Earth. In addition to this tension, the temperature inside the diesel-powered submarine reached 60 degrees Celsius, and the crew was also breathing air polluted with combustion exhaust and the smell of diesel. Likewise, stocks of food, water, and fuel began to run out. In the midst of all this, the American warships discover the submarine, but they do not know about the nuclear torpedo and begin directing sonar towards it at the same time, which made the situation inside the submarine resemble torture, which the communications officer described as being inside an oil barrel being hit by 1,000 hammers at the same time for 5 continuous hours. Over time, the ships began dropping training bombs towards the submarine as a warning to push it to the surface. Because of all this psychological and physical pressure, the submarine commander, Valentin Savitsky, thinks that the training bombs are real bombs. So he says, "We will die, but we will sink them all." He begins preparing the nuclear torpedo for launch, but in order for it to be launched, 2 others, who are the senior officers on the submarine, must agree according to Soviet protocol. One of them agreed and the other refused, and he is the hero of our story, named Vasily Arkhipov. He confirms that the bombs are training bombs and are a signal to board only and not to sink the submarine, and he asks them to trust him. And while the submarine commander accuses him of cowardice, he will insist on his position. But why? Listen to this plot twist. Vasily was not an ordinary officer, but he was one of the members of the ill-fated K-19 nuclear submarine, and the only one of them who survived and witnessed for himself what a simple radiation leakage does to human bodies. He did not want anyone to be exposed to this, let alone be the cause of a nuclear war whose victims would be in the millions. In the face of his insistence on his position, the submarine commander had no choice but to send a message of surrender and rise to the surface of the sea, and he was surprised that the ship's crew signaled for them to retreat and return to Russia. Upon their return to the Soviet Union, although Vasily saved his crew and even humanity, he would be told by senior leaders that sinking with your submarine was more honorable than what you did, and for the rest of his life he would refuse to talk about the Cuban crisis until his death in 1998 from kidney cancer as a result of radiation, which he was exposed to in the K-19 submarine. Number 4, false alarm. On September 1st of 1983, a South Korean passenger plane lost its way and mistakenly entered Soviet airspace. The Soviets sent a warplane to track down the intruding plane, believing it to be a spy plane. The Soviets shot down the plane, even though the military pilot confirmed that it was a civilian passenger plane, and all the passengers of 16 different nationalities, including Americans, died. Relations became tense, and the United States launched military training exercises simulating attacks on sites in the Soviet Union. In the midst of this inflammatory atmosphere, Russian Colonel Stanislav Petrov was head of the early warning center in the city of Serpukhov, and his mission was to monitor and report any attack or potential attack against Russia. On the morning of September 26th, while Colonel Stanislav was doing his work, suddenly the alarms went off. He hurried and looked at the radar screen, and 5 American missiles appeared approaching towards Russia on the radar screen. The colonel hurried to inform the commanders, but he waited a little and thought about the matter. If the United States of America wanted to attack the Soviet Union, the attack would be with hundreds or even thousands of missiles in order to surprise and subjugate the Soviet Union, and not with just 5 missiles. Then, if he informed the commanders about the attack, and they responded in turn, and it was just a mistake in the equipment, this would lead to a 3rd nuclear world war, and he would bear the full consequences of it. So he chose to wait and not inform the commanders, and it was the longest half hour he had ever lived in his life. Fortunately, his analysis was correct and the attack did not occur, and the warning was the result of sunlight reflecting off the clouds. After the Soviet leaders learned of what happened that day, he was tried military-wise on charges of high treason and stripped of his military rank, and he continued to suffer from poverty and shame, until the truth was revealed after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, and Stanislav Petrov was given the honor he deserved from many countries, including the United States of America, as a hero to humanity who saved it from destruction. Number 3, the Chernobyl disaster. On April 26, 1986, at the Soviet Chernobyl nuclear plant, which is currently located in Ukraine, those responsible for the plant wanted to conduct a safety test to ensure the safety of reactor number 4 in the event of a power outage. When the test began, the temperature of the reactor core rose so high that it disrupted the cooling and control system. Only moments passed until the reactor core exploded, destroying the reactor cover, throwing tons of radioactive materials and fumes into the air, and killing 32 workers at the plant immediately. The Soviets did not move until hours after the incident, but they did not announce the incident, and the nearby cities were not evacuated so that the news would not spread and harm the reputation of the Soviet Union. Their priority was to bury the reactor with tons of sand and concrete to reduce radioactive emissions by helicopters, fire brigades, civil defense, and the army, many of whom died as a result of their exposure to nuclear radiation. But despite all attempts to hide the accident, nuclear energy scientists in Sweden, which is about 1,500 kilometers away from the Chernobyl plant site, noticed large quantities of nuclear radiation and radioactive materials coming from the direction of the Soviet Union. So they contacted them, and after debate and back and forth, the Soviets admitted the accident, but they downplayed its seriousness and said that the radiation rate did not exceed 3.6 Roentgens, which is a small percentage. And they were honest about this because they were using measuring devices with a range of only 3.6 Roentgens. But when they used devices with a range of 200 Roentgens, the indicator indicated a number of 200 Roentgens. And when using devices with a range of 2,000 Roentgens were measured. And when using devices with a range of 10,000 Roentgens, a full 10,000 Roentgens were measured. You motherfucker, you have a disaster that could destroy us all and hiding it. In order to imagine the scale of the disaster, the amount of nuclear radiation and radioactive materials that were released from the reactor is equal to twice the radiation produced by the Hiroshima bomb every hour. Europe forgets its differences with the Soviets and unites to evacuate the cities surrounding the reactor within a radius of 30 kilometers. The reactor is buried with tons of reinforced concrete, amounting to about 700,000 tons of concrete and iron, in order to stop the emission of radioactive materials. But this great edifice had a shelf life of 30 years, ending in 2016. So many countries around the world participated in creating a new cemetery that was assembled near the reactor, with a height greater than the Statue of Liberty and an area larger than the base of the Eiffel Tower, at a cost of up to $1 billion, and it has a shelf life of up to 100 years. This structure was dragged to cover the reactor and prevent radiation in 2012. There is no accurate number of Chernobyl victims, but estimates indicate that the number ranges from 6,000 to 8,000 people who were killed as a result of the explosion or from radiation poisoning and cancer, while there are studies that say that the victims are estimated at hundreds of thousands as a result of radiation poisoning. Number 2, World War I. History is a bad joke, and if you don't believe this, listen to this story. The Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary, a man called Archduke Franz Ferdinand, decided on June 28, 1914, to visit the city of Sarajevo, which was under the rule of the Austrian Empire at the time, to express his friendliness and desire for reform. But a large portion of its people are Serbs who want to secede. His visit angered the members of a separatist organization called the Black Hand, and they decided to assassinate the Crown Prince and assigned one of them, Gavrilo Princip, to carry out the assassination. Indeed, he waited among the crowds that were receiving and greeting the Archduke, who came with his wife in an open car. He took out a hand grenade from his pocket and threw it into the car. It hit the floor of the car, jumped out, and exploded. The Archduke and his wife did not suffer a single scratch, and the assassination attempt failed. Gavrilo got angry and left the place and went to drink tea or eat a sandwich or something on a side street. But unfortunately, the Archduke wanted to visit the injured, and on his way back, the driver lost his way and headed to the same side street where Gavrilo was located. And when he saw him, thus began the war that was called the Great or World War, because no one knew that it was only the first, and the second version would soon be put on the market. The Entente powers, or allies, namely Serbia, Russia, France, Britain, and their allies on the one hand, and the Central Powers, namely Austria, Hungary, Germany, and the Ottoman Empire, on the other hand, fought in this war, and it led to the killing of between 16 and 20 million people, in addition to millions of wounded. The war ends with the defeat of Germany and the Central Powers, the announcement of its surrender, and Germany signing the Treaty of Versailles in 1918. But if someone asked me why you chose the First World War and not the Second to put it in the video, even though the number of its victims was much greater and reached 60 million people, because there simply would not have been a Second World War without the First World War and its consequences. The Treaty of Versailles, which the Germans signed, is described by many historians as carrying in its womb the fetus of World War II. Despite the conditions that made Germany unable to form a strong army, it caused an economic and political crisis that paved the way for the ignition of popular anger that ultimately led to the rise of Nazism and the ignition of World War II. The German army's heavy weapons, such as tanks, artillery, submarines, and aircraft, were removed. The number of the army was limited to only 100,000 soldiers and the navy to 15,000 soldiers. This is in addition to the huge compensation that Germany was forced to pay, which was about 269 billion German mark. This led the country to enter into a period of hyperinflation, to the point that at that time the US dollar was worth a trillion mark. Yes, trillion marks. Take this billion marks, my son, and buy yourself a lollipop or something. As a result of Germany's humiliation and these harsh conditions, a generation of German youth began to form, from which Hitler included, who carried the defeat and its consequences to German politicians. And Hitler took advantage of this to rally the masses to his side with his ability to deliver enthusiastic speeches to gain power, rebuild the army, and begin waging wars on his neighbors. Number 1. Bubonic Plague. In 1347, during the siege of the Mongol armies of the city of Kaffa in the Crimean Peninsula, the Mongol commander Janibek Khan noticed deadly, strange, and contagious symptoms spreading throughout his army. A large boils the size of an egg appeared on the bodies of some soldiers, filled with blood and pus, and other symptoms such as nausea, vomiting, and fever. And within a short time, the infected die. Janibek Khan did not break the siege and withdraw, nor did he bury the bodies or even burn them, but he did something that was, let's say, more creative. He ordered the soldiers to place the infected bodies in catapults and launch them towards the besieged city, thus making him the first to wage a biological war in history. Indeed, Janibek Khan's plan succeeds, and most of the residents of the city of Kaffa become infected, but some of them manage to escape the siege and head to Italy. In October 1347, 12 ships coming from the besieged city anchored in the port of Sicily. And when the port workers boarded the ships, they were surprised that all the ship's crew were either dead or dying, and their bodies were full of large black boils. So they called these ships the ships of death, and they immediately expelled them from the port, but it was too late. The plague, or the Black Death as the Europeans called it, has already spread, and within 1 year, the epidemic will invade Sicily, and from there to all of Europe and North Africa, and will lead to the death of about 150 to 200 million people around the world, and the death of 25 to 50 million people in Europe, or about a third of its population, to the point that corpses were scattered in the streets and homes, and no one would bury them for fear of infection. The plague will become an endemic disease in Europe and spread in waves every 5 or 6 years from the year 1347 until the 19th century. Therefore, do not be surprised that it was present in the story of Newton's life in the year 1665, or what is known as the Great Plague of London, or when it spread among the ranks of Napoleon's army at the siege of Acre City in 1799. Doctors at the time did not have any answer about the nature of this epidemic or ways to prevent it, as science did not discover germs and parasites until the 19th century. So, some doctors were convinced that the disease was transmitted through bad air and unpleasant odors, or what is known as the miasma theory. And based on this theory, French doctor Charles Delorme will invent the medical mask that will be a symbol of the Black Plague throughout history. This beak-like mask contains roses, perfume, cinnamon, honey, and some spices to resist bad air and bad odors. And if you think that the miasma theory is stupid, wait to learn about the other methods of treating the plague at that time. For example, there was the Vickery method named after its inventor, Thomas Vickery, where he would bring a chicken, remove its back feathers, and place the chicken directly on the patient's sores and wait. If the chicken became infected, in his view, this is evidence that the chicken draws the disease from the patient's body through its butt. There were methods that relied on mixtures, herbs, and magical treatments, which were of no benefit. And there was even a method of treatment using human urine and feces. And, of course, there was the common method at that time to treat any disease, which was bloodletting method. The church also made its contribution, as the priests and pastors spread the word that this epidemic was a punishment from God, which led to the spread of groups called flagellants roaming the cities, flogging themselves with whips that had nails as a form of purification from sins and repentance. This led to the spread of the infection further and had adverse consequences for the church itself as a result of the spread of the disease among the ranks of bishops, priests, and pastors as well. With the failure of all these treatments, conspiracy theories began to appear, and the Roma and Jewish minorities were accused of poisoning the water in wells and spreading this epidemic, which resulted in acts of violence and killing against these minorities, which prompted Pope Clement VI in 1348 to issue a decree acquitting the Jews and Roma and condemning this violence, and said, minorities can't spread a disease that kills them too. The situation remained like this until the year 1377, when the port of Ragusa in Sicily decided to impound any ship for 40 days, which is pronounced quaranta giorni in Italian, from which the word quarantine was derived. This was the first correct step in limiting the spread of the disease, and most European ports will follow this procedure. But this did not prevent the plague, but it was a step in the right direction. With the advancement of medicine and science in the year 1894, the French scientist Alexander Yersin discovered the bacteria that caused the plague and discovered that it was transmitted from fleas and the mice that carry it to humans. Treatments for the plague will later appear after the discovery of antibiotics. If you like the video, support us by subscribing to the channel, leave a comment. Goodbye.